I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we will be discussing a new book titled China's Quest for Military Supremacy, written by Dr. Joel Wuthnow and Dr. Philip C. Saunders. The book is already available on Amazon. How has the PLA transformed itself in the recent years? What does a relationship look like between the PLA and the CCP? How do different domains of the PLA work together, and how are they preparing for a potential war with Taiwan and the United States? How is Beijing using the PLA to shape its external security environment? To explore these questions, we're joined by both authors, Dr. Joel Wuthnow and Dr. Philip C. Saunders. Both of them are speaking in their personal capacity and not on behalf of the U.S. government. Dr. Joel Wuthnow is a senior research fellow in the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs within the Institute for National Strategic Studies at NDU. His research areas include Chinese foreign policy and security policy, Chinese military affairs, U.S.-China relations, and strategic developments in East Asia. In addition to his duties at INSS, he also serves as an adjunct professor in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Philip C. Saunders is director of the INSS Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs. Dr. Saunders previously worked at the Monterey Institute of International Studies, where he served as director of the East Asia Nonproliferation Program from 1999 to 2003. He also serves as an adjunct instructor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Joel and Phil, thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Thanks, Bonnie. Happy to be here.
So maybe, Joel, start with you. I'd like to start by asking why you wrote this book and what were some of the core motivations behind the book.
Well, I think we realized that there was a really big demand and really a need for more education in our world, in DoD, among students, graduate students, even policymakers and practitioners to know more about the PLA. This is a topic that's becoming more relevant to folks, even if you're not specifically focused on the Indo-Pacific, because China's everywhere and the PLA has a lot of presence, even though sometimes it's a bit modest. Folks coming out of different quarters really wanted to know more about the PLA, but the problem is there wasn't kind of a standard book or a textbook or even just kind of a general primer about the PLA. And so we'd been teaching this class on the PLA at NDU and also at Georgetown and at SAIS. And so we had a pretty decent course together, but there wasn't a book based on it. So what we did is we essentially took the course, about 12 weeks of material. We condensed it, we made it reasonably readable, and we compiled it into a book. And so readers of this book will essentially get the same type of education on the PLA, basic questions about the PLA that any of our students would get coming into this topic from a baseline of nothing and getting some information about the PLA over about 12 weeks, but this would be in a textbook format.
Thank you, Joel. And just reading through your book, it's obviously very rich with a number of different angles looking at the PLA. I was quite struck by one of the arguments in your book that the PLA is entering a new era, and you point to the 2022 Chinese military demonstrations around Taiwan following then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taipei as an example of a PLA that is more confident and perhaps bolder. Could you describe how your book characterizes the shift in the PLA and what is driving this new era and when did it begin?
Yeah, so, you hear this phrase, the new era, in China all the time, and it's sort of synonymous with Xi Jinping. He comes in 2012, and in 2017, they create this verbiage called the new era, and everything in China is something plus the new era. All that means is that this is things that have been taking place under Xi, and it's differentiated from the Mao era, and then the reform era, Deng Xiaoping and his two successors, and now we're in the new era. And so what that means, I think, for the PLA is that they have an entire new suite of capabilities, some of which they've been working on, like the aircraft carriers, from well before Xi Jinping even came in. But it's not just the capabilities. Xi really puts his own imprint on the PLA. He undertakes, a decade ago now, this massive organizational restructuring that makes the PLA today very different from what he inherited. It's actually smaller, even though it's still really big, but it's smaller than it used to be. It's much more joint. It's better managed. And he's really pushing forward this thing called military-civil fusion to gain efficiencies and to work on, bringing high technology into the PLA. And so he inherits a lot of kind of ambition, and he links that into his China dream. And he sometimes refers to this so-called strong army dream. And the idea is to make the PLA really a very formidable force. And so that's a lot of what we're seeing in the new era. But it's not just the capabilities or the reforms, it's also the ways that they're using it. And so, before Xi comes in, the PLA is already starting to get a little bit assertive, especially in maritime disputes. This predates him, but he really kicks things up a notch. And so whether it's across the Taiwan Strait, just symbolized by that dramatic show of force in 2022, but in other disputes as well, in the South China Sea, occasionally across the Sino-Indian border, sometimes with Japan, they're really starting to put this new capable PLA to use. They are more confident. They're certainly more capable. They have a lot new equipment that they're putting online. And so Xi Jinping is sort of the grandmaster, if you will, of all of this kind of set of activities. And so we regard this as, in general, a new era. There's not one date important. 2012 was important because that's when Xi comes in, but it's really more of a progression, I think, over time to see this dramatic rise of the PLA as a credible, strong, warfighting and coercive instrument for the CCP.
I would add to that you're starting to see the PLA used to shape the Indo-Pacific region. And some of that's through things like maritime territorial disputes. Some of it is through military diplomacy throughout the region. Some of it is showing off capabilities in ways that they either didn't have the capabilities before or they weren't willing to show them before. Like conducting exercises with Russia, conducting their own exercises in the region, sometimes near Taiwan. So it's the use of military power to shape the regional environment. That's one of the things that's new in the new era.
And Phil, if I could just follow up on that, you mentioned that in terms of China using the PLA to shape the region, there are both new activities but new capabilities. What are some of the new capabilities that really stand out for you?
Obviously, the carriers are a new capability. But I think they're starting to have advanced destroyers and cruisers that they can deploy further away from China. So a good example for that is something new that they deployed those down to around Australia and New Zealand, the further south that the PLA had ever gone. And they didn't go there to do a joint exercise with the Australians, which is something they've done before. They did a unilateral live fire exercise in between New Zealand and Australia. That's a show of force, and that's not something that you would have seen the PLA do before, and they certainly wouldn't have done it so far away from China before. So that's a combination of new capabilities, but also greater willingness to show them off to try to shape the region and shape countries in the region.
Speaking of China's recent military exercise close to Australia and New Zealand, it was quite interesting that these February 2025 live fire exercises were relatively unprecedented in terms of China's operations, but also they came with little advance notice to both regional governments as well as commercial entities. How does this fit into how the PLA is used? Because it was also very interesting that I think 1 or 2 days right before the military exercise, you saw China resume senior military talks with the Australians, talks that had been on hold since 2019. And it's quite interesting that China, the PLA, would engage in such a, I guess, what most would call aggressive, assertive military exercise shortly after a breakthrough in diplomatic military-to-military ties. How do you reconcile these two seemingly contradictory activities from the PLA?
Well, of course, China and Australia have had their ups and downs in recent years on a range of issues, so it hasn't been a relationship that's been very close. And you're correct that reestablishing mill-to-mill dialogue is generally seen as a means of stabilizing relationship. And these kind of live fire exercises so close to Australia in an unprecedented way without much warning can only be read as an attempt at intimidation. So, yes, we are willing to talk to you, but you need to have a sense of which country is more powerful. So that's how I would interpret it. It's kind of a dual-edged message. Yes, we want to talk, but understand who is the more powerful country in this relationship.
Yeah, I mean, Bonnie, honestly, I would suggest to you that the recent exercises off of Australia, it's not quite unprecedented, but it got a lot of attention. And one of the things that they did was to show that they could create real disruptions for Australia, which is a little bit far away from the regional conflicts. Australia is important as a base for U.S. forces. It could be fairly important in any Taiwan contingency. And so what the PLA is demonstrating is that they have now the capability to create regional destructions, to bring the fight in a way farther away from their own home court than they used to be able to do. And I think that's really just emblematic of the increasing arsenal of the PLA in terms of those kind of long-range capabilities. They're no longer just simply, fighting within the first island chain. They can muster capabilities, whether it's in terms of long-range missiles. And don't forget, they also test-fired that ICBM just a few months ago in the same general, vicinity. Naval forces, whether it's bombers or whether it's, let's say, for example, cyber. So they can bring destructive capabilities to distances that they previously couldn't. And that's Australia, certainly. And that's also potentially the United States. I think that's a really big difference from the PLA that we, in a way, grew up observing, which was really a land force, a force that could operate slightly offshore, but not much. If you go back, for example, to the 95, 96 Taiwan Strait crisis, there really wasn't much they could do even to oppose carriers that were operating roughly along the first island chain. And so now what they're showing you is that they can really extend that defensive perimeter well away from their territory to hold at risk countries, whether it's allies like Australia or Japan or the Philippines, but also the home territory of the United States, and to create costs for us and risks if we were to try to intervene yet again in any regional conflict.
And there's a little of an interaction between capabilities and message. One of the things about the PLA Navy's new ships is they have much more effective air defenses that they take with them. So you can send a destroyer or a cruiser out further away where there's no land-based air defense to help you. And now they have very capable surface-to-air missiles on board and can protect themselves from attack. So that's a new military capability, but it lets you use the ships in a new way.
Fascinating. I want to go back to what the two of you were talking about earlier in terms of understanding this new era in the PLA. Joel, you mentioned that this new era is very much linked to Xi Jinping, and he's played quite a critical role in reforming and transforming the PLA. As Xi Jinping looks at the PLA, what large goals has he set for the PLA? And what does he view as major problems or challenges that the PLA still needs to overcome?
Yeah, so I think his agenda is pretty clear. He's been clear all along that he expects the PLA to really modernize, to become world-class in terms of its capabilities. I think over the last maybe half decade or so, we've also gotten more detail just in terms of his ambitions. Across the Taiwan Strait, I think it's generally acknowledged now that the 2027 modernization goal basically has been linked. It has something to do with being ready for a major conflict with Taiwan, and which I think he anticipates could very well involve the United States as well. So that's been a major focus of his getting the PLA ready. And why does he have to give them those goals? I think clearly the reason is that he believes they're not currently ready. Otherwise, why do you need a goal? And so what are some of the problems? He himself has talked about some of the personnel weaknesses, deficiencies. This is spread throughout the PLA's propaganda, sort of critiquing their own lack of combat experience, their lack of proficiency in modern combat, really as kind of a key weakness. He talked about the organizational deficiencies early on, justifying the need to really overhaul, the PLA's structure. But I think, the major problem currently that he faces, and we talk about this at length in the book, really is the lack of trust between himself and those closest to him in the PLA. Not so much in the sense that he thinks they're going to, plan a coup or just simply fail to follow orders, but that they don't care as much as he does about the party's vision, that, these are people who are spending their time lining their own pockets, taking bribes, taking kickbacks, not focusing on the mission. And so he's faced this problem for the last dozen years that he's been around. And I think that more than anything else, more than hardware, more than, the money that he's pumping into the PLA, more than the sense of prioritization of missions, it's the people around him that I think for him is the biggest weakness and really in some sense, almost the most intractable problem, because it's hard to buy your way out of that problem. It's a culture of distrust and dysfunction. And so getting into that problem, I think, has perplexed him and troubled him over the last dozen years.
Joel, to that point, how has Xi Jinping tried to bring the PLA under the CCP's control? And do you still see much progress needs to be done in this area? Are there still sources of tension between the CCP and the PLA?
Yeah, I think there's still certainly a tension there. I mean, we've seen that over the last year and a half, just in this near ceaseless spate of purges that he's had to undergo, not with random people who are kind of deep down inside the bureaucracy, but with people who are the closest generals to him, members of the Central Military Commission, two defense ministers, the commander, the political commissar of the rocket force, which is his strategic nuclear force. People in the most sensitive positions of the PLA somehow lost his confidence. And so, how's he getting around this? Well, he's trying. He's trying to put in new people. He's trying to give speeches. He held a conference at Yan'an, where the kind of historic base of the Red Army, in joining the PLA to say, look, you've lost your values. You need to get back to who you are. So it's the education, it's the indoctrination, it's the personnel, the purges, and he's trying a lot of different things. But, I just keep coming back to this point that the fact that you still have these problems a dozen years, this isn't the first year of his tenure. This is well into his tenure, but the fact that he's still, sort of trying to get at this problem, I think it just simply indicates how difficult it is for him to get the PLA in line. And there's good reasons for it. Phil and I wrote an article for the Journal of Contemporary China trying to really understand this. But the fundamental thing here is that the PLA is very autonomous. They're not separate from the party, but they are distinct in a way from the civilian party masters. And the leaders of the party, from Xi going back all the way to Deng Xiaoping, have needed to give them autonomy in order to get their compliance, their political compliance. And Xi has not fundamentally shaken that bargain. He hasn't overturned the apple cart. He hasn't said, we're going to put in civilian political appointees, equivalents. We're not going to bring in outside inspectors to go through your books. So he's actually respected their boundaries in some pretty important ways. I think he realizes that you can't go too far. You don't want to make too many enemies with the PLA because, there could come a time in which, this force will turn against you. And so he's selectively purged. He's tried to, promote his own authority and reputation inside the army in different ways, but he still respected boundaries. And I think that has been a necessary evil for Xi Jinping to be able to remain in charge of this country for this period of time.
At the end of the day, the PLA is policing itself. And I think what Xi Jinping wants is them to do so as the basis of members of the Chinese Communist Party in good standing who believe in Marxism, Leninism, and will act in a way consistent with those values and do the right thing. And he's been sort of consistently frustrated that they behave like military guys. And sometimes they behave like corrupt military guys, and they don't internalize those values and act on them in the way that he really would like them to. And so you've seen an increased emphasis on political education, political training, 20% of the time studying this stuff, studying Xi Jinping's speeches, but it doesn't seem to take. And so he has to use other tools to monitor them and to purge corrupt people. But I think that's part of the frustration. He wants them to behave like good party members first, and that's not how they behave.
And Phil, given how much time, I think you said 20% of the time that PLA members are now engaging in political education training, how has that affected the actual operational capability or their ability to train or exercise?
I mean, it's hard to be precise, but one way of thinking about it is it's a tax on training. If you're spending one day a week on political work, that's time you're not out on the field training, you're not practicing, you're not studying how to do military things. And that's got to have some negative impact on military proficiency. Xi Jinping obviously thinks that's a trade-off worth making. If this is what it takes to make the PLA obedient and politically reliable, well, then you'll give up a little bit of operational proficiency to be sure you have that. Ideally, you want both things. You want a military that's politically reliable, read, and professionally competent expert. But if you have to choose, you want them to obey orders. He doesn't want to choose. He wants both things, but he has to keep coming back to the political education and the political reliability side.
Yeah, and Bonnie, there's kind of a different way of looking at this too. I mean, this is not something that in any Western military we would do. And so we often kind of regard this as a tax. If you're sitting in a classroom learning about, the great military theories of Xi Jinping, you're probably not out in the field learning how to use equipment. So we regard this as a bit of a weakness, but for them, they, I think, would say, well, this is essential to who we are. It is essential that the people in the PLA understand the party's missions, its ideology, its rationale, so that in any real use of force or any war, soldiers would understand. They would understand and be very committed. So this is, I think, from their perspective, necessary to achieve cohesion, unity of thought, morale. And in some way, I think they would pride themselves, on this extensive political indoctrination they're giving. I think when they look at the parallel conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine, and many Russians doubting the reason for war, the necessity of war, some soldiers apparently not fighting or trying to defect or flee, I think they would regard their own investments in political indoctrination and control of information, meaning that they're not getting counter narratives inside the PLA. I think some in them, at least to justify why they're spending so much time on this, would say, look, this is necessary in order to make sure that when we do fight, we will fight together and we won't have this barrage of defections and, churn within the military that the Russians have had because they didn't invest in this.
And so in addition to issues of general CCP control over the PLA, as well as Xi Jinping's trust of the PLA, your book also talks about how PLA organizational culture creates obstacles for quick and effective decision-making, and that the Central Military Commission tends to micromanage decisions. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And maybe are there any examples that you have in mind of this playing out in real life? And how might this impact how the PLA could operate either on a day-to-day, in a crisis, or in a larger contingency?
I think part of that answer is the dual command system. At every unit, you have a commander and a political commissar, and they have to jointly figure out what to do for the good of the unit. That's an impediment to quick decision-making. In a combat environment, the commander is supposed to take the lead, but they have to take the lead looking over their shoulder, knowing they will have to justify what they did to the party committee. So that's kind of one piece of it. The other is they have more integrated command and control, and that lets information move from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top, but it also lets the senior leadership interfere with what's going on. And the organizational culture of the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party, for that matter as well, is to listen to what the top wants and try to do what you are told. And that's not a recipe for taking initiative at the lower level. And so in a paradoxical way, the better communications between the top and the bottom may make the bottom wait for instructions, wait for orders, and be a little more passive. And that's a weakness in a combat situation. I think the other thing is, to some degree, they compensate for this with detailed planning. So let's figure out what everybody is supposed to do. This service is going to do this mission, that service is going to do that mission, and everybody will know the plan and practice the plan. And that way you get unity of effort. But the problem is, once you start a conflict, the plan no longer fits the circumstances, and you have to adapt to that. And if the way you adapt is, well, we got to hold a party committee session and figure out what's going on and reprioritize and replan, that really slows you down in a combat environment. And if you don't have commanders who are used to reacting to the circumstance on the ground and are in a more passive position, that could be a real weakness in a combat situation.
And I would just going to add to that, Bonnie, if you're looking for, sort of concrete evidence, I would actually go back to the Korean War. And just to kind of demonstrate Phil's point that, this was the conflict we actually had Chinese POWs from the U.S. And so we got to understand, how the system worked down at the platoon level and below. And when they were on the offensive, when they were kind of executing their plans, the system worked pretty well because everyone knew what they were supposed to do. But it was when they faced friction and resistance and their plans were frustrated, then those organizational dynamics really start to show their weaknesses, because you had commanders bickering, sometimes behind the scenes or sometimes in front of the troops, even with political commissars, and they couldn't quite figure out what to do. No one was fully empowered to make decisions. And so it really became a hindrance to them. And that was in a very slow-moving conflict where you had time to sit down and make decisions. And the wars of the future are not like that. The wars of the future are ones in which every second matters. And so having a situation where you have so many different points of failure, so many people who have to agree to everything, and that's not how we do things. But they have embraced this system, I think, because of the necessity for the party to always know everything that's happening and to approve everything. And so they've embraced it. But the question is, well, in a fast-moving modern conflict, can they get away with it? And what problems are they going to face when inevitably in any future conflict, their plans fail once again? And I think that's when you will see the real evidence of the problems of this system.
In terms of larger contingencies, both of you have emphasized the importance for detailed planning. But if we were to look at the day-to-day in terms of how the PLA train and exercise in many of the regions that you've discussed earlier, where you're seeing more PLA assertiveness, are most of the recent exercises scripted, or are you seeing more unscripted military exercises throughout, particularly the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I think, frankly, most of their exercises still follow a script, and not only exercises, but also, sort of coercive operations. So just for example, 2022, Bonnie, this is something that we wrote about back in August. I think they could see the crisis coming. They knew that Nancy Pelosi would visit Taiwan, and they had weeks, if not months, to prepare a plan. And when she left the island, all they needed to do was to execute the plan. I think what happens, it's very different if they have a crisis that they don't anticipate. And so there, you see, I think, a little bit more, if not maybe a lot more in some cases, kind of dysfunction in their system. So, for example, and Phil might have examples too, but I think about the spy balloon incident, that's something that they did not plan. It was not scripted. It was obviously some sort of a mishap or something that happened there, but their system looked much less flexible. There were disconnects between parts of the military, between the military and the diplomatic arms, between the bureaucracy and the senior leadership, and it was a mess. And so I think there is an important difference. They can plan well. If they want to coerce, they will plan for it and they will execute it, and they do have that unity of thinking. But when they are faced with a dilemma that they did not anticipate, I think, again, that's kind of where their systems start to face issues.
I want to follow up another point that the two of you mentioned as one of the major changes in the PLA, as well as Xi's main contributions, which is to make the PLA more joint. What are some of the most significant reforms that you've seen under Xi Jinping in the recent years in terms of PLA jointness?
Right. So, I think just as a baseline, being joint means that all the different services and branches can cooperate, pretty well. So not just kind of coordinate, but also to really plan together, to train together at a very, intricate level, and ultimately to fight together. So the PLA strategy moved in this direction in the early 1990s because they saw the U.S. fighting jointly in the Gulf. And they understood that in the future, the Air Force and the Navy and the ground forces, they'd have to coordinate, but also to really plan together and operate alongside each other. And that was critical if they were even going to think about conducting an island landing campaign, right? The invasion of Taiwan would involve everybody being a team player. The PLA wasn't set up like that, though, and they faced a lot of bureaucratic stovepiping. The services weren't even in a chain of command where they would cooperate. And so Xi Jinping, I think he or his advisors, people around him, they recognized that, the PLA just wasn't set up for this. And so he came in, and in 2015, he started this huge overhaul. And he said, we have to change the entire command structure. We have to have joint commands. And so they created these things called the theater commands that are new. And they're new because the commanders have authority, over the Air Force, the Navy, the ground forces, some of the conventional missile forces as well. And it's very important that they have this because now they can create those joint plans, those contingency plans. They can institute training exercising where everyone's taking part of these things. And they can use these capabilities together in an integrated fashion to coerce other states. So again, this 2022 example on Taiwan, that involved everybody. Missiles flying at the same time that you have live fire drills in the 7 zones. At the same time, you had Air Force planes. And there was no fratricide. There was no miscommunication. It was very well orchestrated because they had this command structure in place. And so I think it was a pivotal sort of moment and contribution, that Xi did this. It doesn't mean they're perfect, but it was as important as, for folks who know our system, 1986, the Goldwater-Nichols Act, which sort of forced all the services to get together and, cooperate. It was as important as that. And I think it will be essential if they are ever ordered, into combat that they have this system.
I would add to that, the old system could not fight jointly. We conclude in the book that the new system is capable of doing these kind of major joint operations. But to some degree, the remaining challenge for the PLA is to push that down to lower levels, not just coordinating at the theater command level, but figuring out how the Air Force can support Army operations or how the rocket force can support the Navy. Because I think the essence of joint warfare is you think there's synergies between the different services operating in different domains and being able to apply that force together. That's a really challenging thing to do. And it's not just a big exercise where everybody has a little part in it, but it's more down at the operational level where the Air Force is conducting strikes to support Navy operations, for example. And you get synergies between these different services with their different capabilities, making each other more efficient. I think that's the goal that the PLA has. They're still working on getting there, and there's a lot still to do for that.
In terms of engaging in large joint operations, and this was referenced earlier with the 2027 date, I think one of the largest operations they're planning for is the amphibious invasion of Taiwan. As you look at China's capability development and all the areas that the PLA has improved over the years, how much progress has China made in actually preparing for this really complex amphibious invasion? And do you think China is on track for 2027?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, they have obviously been thinking through these issues. They have been holding, more intricate exercises, which I think recently Admiral Paparo at Indo-Pacific described as, sort of like rehearsals or something like this for these eventualities. They've been, trying to get after some of the more intricate problems. For example, they don't have enough ships in the Navy to carry the requisite number of troops. Given attrition, they simply don't have enough ships. And so they've been experimenting with, integrating civilian ships, ferries, and so on into those kinds of exercises. They've been making improvements in, the missile capabilities, the artillery. The Army has a very strong new artillery system with a whole lot of missiles that can, essentially reach Taiwan, right? So this is progress. And then as part of that campaign, if it was just China and Taiwan, that would be one thing. But they sort of anticipate that this is China, Taiwan, plus the United States. And so, as I sort of suggested earlier, they're having to develop new capabilities to hold U.S. forces at risk as well. And so that's why I think they have been at an accelerated rate, pushing through new missile programs, long-range missiles, focusing on their, cyber, even their counter space technologies in order to hold us at risk as well. So where does that leave them? How close are they to achieving this goal? Well, they haven't told us, so we don't know. And part of the problem, sort of the analytic problem in answering the question is that the other side is not just staying still, right? I mean, Taiwan and the United States and other potential, parties are also modernizing, and so even though the PLA is improving, it's also the case that the U.S. military is improving as well, changing its own operational concepts, bringing new capabilities online and more to follow as well. Taiwan is reforming. They're obviously increasing defense spending and buying new things, some of which from the United States, building some of their own things. And so the question is really, what is the net assessment? Where are we in terms of the balance of forces? Where is the PLA? And they also have this instructive, experience from, Russia's kind of botched invasion of Ukraine behind them as well, sort of instructing them that on paper, this looks solid, but in practice, there's a lot of things that you can't anticipate, and so to what extent are they taking that into consideration? I think they are. But I think, at the end of the day, we don't know. At 2027, I think what I would worry about the most is that the PLA, informs Xi Jinping that they've succeeded. I mean, he's handed them this deadline. He said, here's money, here's attention, here's a clear timetable, you had better deliver. I guess my worry is no one in the PLA is going to say we failed to deliver. They're going to perhaps tell him they're fully capable when maybe even fact they're not. And then the question is, well, does he believe them? Is he, perhaps confident or even overconfident based on what he's being told? So there's a lot of those sorts of issues below the surface here that we don't have a solid grasp on. But just as Putin was sort of maybe led into war by overconfident generals, the worry for me would be that Xi somehow comes to believe that perhaps he's ready when in fact perhaps he's not.
One area of PLA modernization that has attracted a lot of attention, both in the United States and internationally, has been China's rapid nuclear modernization. And your book explains that China has been trying to create a nuclear shield. Could you walk us through that a bit, and how do you think this will impact regional security?
Well, the traditional Chinese view on nuclear weapons is what are they for? They are to deter nuclear attack. And that's really the only thing they are good for. And I think what we see underlying this nuclear expansion, which a couple years ago was about 200 deployed warheads, now, according to the latest U.S. intelligence estimates, is more like 600, is a change in thinking about how much of a nuclear deterrent you need to deter adversary moves, and can you use that for other purposes? So not just to deter a nuclear strike, but perhaps to deter the United States from intervening in the first place. So my colleague David Logan and I call that a nuclear shield, where you're trying to sort of stretch the value of your nuclear deterrent, not just to deter nuclear attack, but also to deter conventional intervention. And we think that's a very plausible explanation for what China's trying to do, to get the United States to think twice. Is it really worth intervening in a Taiwan conflict if there is a risk of that escalating to nuclear war? And trying to inject that thought into American decision makers' minds and influence how they think. For the United States, that's a challenge because as their deterrent is getting bigger, there's not really a first strike option that if the war goes nuclear, China will have nuclear weapons that can target the United States. And that's a challenge to deter them from using them, even though they have a no first use doctrine. So those escalation risks of a conflict that starts out conventionally and might go nuclear is a big challenge for U.S. policymakers. And I think the shift is that China is trying to put that thought in their mind and that maybe it's not worth it. Now, for U.S. policymakers, that's a different problem. Ultimately, the president will make the call on this. But if you're aware that it's a conflict that might go nuclear, it takes a lot of resolve to say, nevertheless, we're going to do this. We have to defend Taiwan either for itself or because that's the linchpin of the U.S. position in Asia, and all our allies will look to whether we do or don't defend Taiwan to think whether we will or won't defend them. It's a challenge. These are the kind of dilemmas I think China's trying to put in the minds of U.S. policymakers. And I think ultimately that's one of the reasons why they're building a much larger nuclear force. There's other reasons to make sure it really deters the U.S., perhaps as a source of prestige of great power status by having a larger nuclear force. But I think the key point is this is a change in thinking. They thought about things differently before Xi Jinping was there, and there seems to have been a change in thinking that took place sometime in 2014, 2015, to rethinking about what's the value of nuclear weapons, and maybe there is value in a larger nuclear force. And what we're seeing happen today with deployed forces and new ICBM silos is the manifestation of that shift in thinking.
Many of our Taiwan friends have voiced their views that they don't think China would ever use nuclear weapons against Taiwan. But it seems like, Phil, what you're saying is we really need to take this possibility very seriously, particularly under Xi Jinping.
It raises the costs and risks of U.S. intervention because there's the possibility of a conventional conflict as it drags on, potentially going nuclear. And that's a sobering thought.
So I'd like to wrap up this podcast by asking the two of you to focus a little bit more on the present day and to perhaps look into the future a bit on how you think the PLA may respond or change under a Trump presidency. So a couple of things. Obviously, China is paying a lot of attention to what's happening in the United States, our leadership change. Are you seeing anything in terms of writing or commentary from Chinese security and defense experts that they believe that there is now more or less room for the PLA to be assertive in the next 4 years under President Trump? And what are PLA analysts most worried about when it comes to the Trump administration and what we may or may not be doing in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I mean, I think that they're certainly observing everything that's taken place. And, we are in another administration. They had, 4 years to evaluate the first Trump administration. And, I think they saw the U.S. moving towards this focus on great power competition. And that's all domain. That's military, economic, diplomatic. And I think they really had to think the best way to respond to that. And a lot of the conclusion that you saw from analysts in China, wasn't that they wanted direct military confrontation with the U.S., but that they really thought that they had other tools of national power, in particular their massive trade balances with their neighbors and other forms of influence that they thought they could use, to try to drive wedges between the U.S. and our closest allies. So now we're, here in a new administration, I think they're still observing, it's not lost on them that a number of key figures have talked about the need to kind of focus from Europe or from the Middle East, more so on the Indo-Pacific theater to kind of rebuild some of our military capabilities there and, what that's going to mean for them. So I think they're still watching. I think they're still waiting. These are very early days. A lot of the key officials who will be responsible for developing the strategy and implementing it and working with our allies are not in place yet. And so I think for me anyway, it's far too soon to say that they either view this as an environment where they have opportunities to press harder, or it's an opportunity where they feel as though they're going to be even more constrained than in the past. I think they're probably planning for all different, eventualities and contingencies. But there is kind of a through line here, across all administrations where they view the weakness of our position in Asia as our distance and our reliance on the allies to host U.S. forces and to provide shelter and so on. And so I think, to come back to that earlier question about Australia, I think, they are looking at different ways to try to perhaps at the same time entice and intimidate those who we rely on the most to, be able to sustain influence and capabilities in the region. I'm sure that will continue to be part of their approach towards us.
I would add to that, I think you see further rebalancing toward Asia is part of the message we're hearing from the Trump administration. Less attention on Europe, less attention on the Middle East, more attention on the Indo-Pacific. And so an obvious question is, does that open opportunities for China and for the PLA? And I think one of the things that stands out as we've done this book and we've sort of tried to make sense of what's happened is that they have remained pretty disciplined and focused on things inside the Indo-Pacific. Yes, they have built aircraft carriers and some more power projection capabilities that they didn't have before. But the PLA's focus is still a regional focus, especially on a conflict over Taiwan. And they've been pretty disciplined in that and not getting drawn into overseas commitments in other regions. What they've done has been peacekeeping deployments under UN auspices or the counter-piracy deployment in the Gulf of Aden, and of course their military base in Djibouti. But it hasn't been an effort to build a massive overseas footprint or to take on large overseas security commitments. They've remained pretty focused and pretty disciplined in their approach to building military capabilities. And a lot of that is preparing for regional contingencies, whether they're on the land borders or in the maritime space. So it may be that the U.S. is doing less in Europe. It may be that the U.S. is doing less in the Middle East. I'm not sure that that's an opportunity that the PLA sees to fill gaps or to do more in those spaces.
And it still might be early days, but do either of you see any indications or activities that the PLA has done recently that are examples of the PLA testing or probing the Trump administration's willingness to operate in the Indo-Pacific or to defend our allies and partners? So, for example, I wonder if the late February exercises near Australia was an example of testing and probing, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
I think the main thing we have seen, and it's been developing for a couple years, is an effort to do more with Russia in the form of joint naval exercises and joint air patrols, including the recent one near Alaska. So this is not probing on allies, but it is Russia and China trying to demonstrate that they can work together militarily in significant ways. And so it's political posturing. We've been doing a lot of work on these exercises, and I think what our main conclusion is they're not that significant militarily, but they're intended to send political signals. And the two militaries and the two countries are working together to do that. I don't know that we've seen major PLA exercises or activities that are really aimed against U.S. allies in Asia so far. But the normal pattern, I think, is when China's faced with a new president, is to try to understand what they want and to try to find a way to broker a stable relationship with them. We're in the very early stages of this administration, and China's in the very early stages of figuring out what the Trump administration is going to do, how they're going to respond, and whether it's possible to create a more stable relationship with the United States. I think while that is happening, the PLA doesn't want to do things that, throw that broader political task off.
Just to kind of build on what Phil was saying is that, we don't see aggressive testing, I think, at this early date, but We can never rule out, because we have in Asia right now, a lot of intermixing of forces between, the PLA, which is flying out and sailing out, and us. And, we're not leaving, we're not going anywhere. And so even if we're in a period where they seem to be, building political relationships and not doing a lot of military signaling just yet, there is a lot of interaction, and there's still the prospect of an accident, of a miscalculation, of a crisis. Remember back 25 years ago when George W. Bush came in, the first crisis that he faced, it came out of nowhere, was the EP3 incident, right? And so I think that's something that he had to wrestle with. And we can never rule such things out, and it could become more likely. And so I think relationships will be very important. I think it's, essential that the militaries continue to talk, but especially that the presidents have a good relationship, because there are accidents, and that could be with the flights, it could be with the ships, it could be something that we can't foresee in cyber or elsewhere. And so the world, I think, is still dangerous, even if we're not in the middle of a crisis right now. And being able to prevent and respond to such things when they happen, to me, it would be essential for any administration coming in to get ahead of that very quickly.
Thank you, Joel and Phil, for sharing some of your insights there in terms of broader implications. And I want to also thank you both for joining me today to preview your new book on the PLA, a book that I hope will become widely used as a textbook and reference for understanding the Chinese military. I really appreciate you both joining, and thank you again.
Thanks, Bonnie. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Bonnie. And as I like to say, it will be available at better bookstores everywhere starting next week.